Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to this lunchtime seminar. I'm David Feldman. I'm the director of the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism. And it's a huge pleasure to be able to introduce our speaker today. Our speaker is Nonna Mayer, the CNRS Research Director Emerita at the Center for European Studies and Comparative Politics of Sciences Po in Paris, a former chair of the French Political Science Association and a member of the French National Consultative Commission for Human Rights since 2015. Hugely eminent, Nonna has perhaps three main current research interests on the electoral dynamic of the populist radical right, on transformations of racism and anti-Semitism, and on relations between minorities and majority populations, and also relations between minorities. And it's really a great honor to have her speak in the seminar today. She'll speak for about half an hour, and then we'll have time for questions and discussions after that. And the title of her presentation is Old and New Anti-Semitism in France. Nonna.
Thank you. I'll try to open my PowerPoint. That's it. Okay. So it's a pleasure for me. Thank you for inviting me to discuss old and new anti-Semitism in France. So first, I'd like to say that France is an interesting case to study because it has the largest Jewish minority in the European Union, almost 500,000, and also a very large number of Muslims, 4 to 5 million. And it's an important moment because there has been a spectacular rise of anti-Semitic acts since the second Intifada in the year 2000, and that has created among French Jews a very strong feeling of insecurity. So it's really something we must dig into. What is the level of anti-Semitism in France today? And the angle I'll take is the debate around new anti-Semitism. The idea that there's a new anti-Semitism structured by anti-Zionism and the demonization of Israel, that it's developing on the left of the political spectrum and among Muslims in the suburbs, in sharp contrast with the old anti-Semitism, which was far more on the far right. So that's going to be I'm trying now to, yes, that works. Just to give you an idea of the anti-Semitic incidents, it's the police data since 1990. In purple, you have the total number of racist acts. In blue somewhere, you must have the anti-Semitism, you see. And you see that it's going up at every turn of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So there is a link with Israel and Zionism. And at the moment, we are at 436 incidents, not all violent, but to give you an idea, there is an important level. We never went back to the levels of the 90s. But I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to focus on opinions. And for me, opinions are important because they reflect the social norms in a society, what's forbidden, what's allowed. And there, clearly, we are not in the 30s. Two, I'll do it in a social science perspective. That is, we are here to understand and explain, not to condemn. And I try to show the complexity of the trends. So, as I said, the theoretical frame will be about the debate of the new forms of prejudice, and it's not specific to anti-Semitism. Since World War II, because of the Holocaust, anti-racism has become the norm in democracies. And when racism expresses itself, not always in the stadiums, but usually in the public debates, it's in subtle forms, covert forms. It's called symbolic, veiled ways. There's quite a literature on that. We can come back to it in the discussion. And in France, there has been a specific debate about the rise of a new Judeophobia, a term forged by Pierre-André Taguieff, because he says that Judeophobia is a specific prejudice against Jews, not against all Semites. That's why he uses the word Judeophobia, masked behind the critics of Israel and Zionism in the name of defense of human rights. And that's the book which has been translated that you may have heard about, Rising from the Muck, the New Anti-Semitism in Europe. So in order to test these theories, I'm going to use survey data as I'm working on opinion. And it's the National Commission for Human Rights. Every year since 1990, they have an annual survey, face-to-face, where we take the time to ask something like 80 to 100 questions. It's national samples. They are representative of the adult population living in metropolitan France of all origins, not only with French citizenships. Over a third of our sample has at least one foreign parent or grandparent. So our sample is representative of France in its diversity. And we have, as I said, some 80 questions exploring all the facets of the perception of the other. What I'm going to see, because I'm trying to stick to half an hour, it's the flaws of the new anti-Semitism thesis. I'll try to show you it's far more complicated. First, I'll show you that anti-Semitism, prejudice, is not on the rise. There's a slow decline. 2, that it's correlated with other forms of prejudice. 3, that it's the old stereotypes about money and power that are the strongest and that persist, not the new ones. 4, Israel and the conflict trigger actions against Jews, but they do not polarize opinions. What structures anti-Semitism is the old stereotypes, and it's still today far stronger on the right and on the far right. So these beautiful curves they have done by a researcher who works with us, whose name is Vincent Tiberi, and it's the longitudinal index of tolerance by a minority. That means he's been working on 75 series of questions asked at least 3 times since 1990. There's a whole statistical procedure. And there it shows the level of tolerance, not of intolerance, but of tolerance, of acceptance of the different minorities. In red, you have the blacks, all the questions about blacks. In blue, about Jews, all the questions about Jews. In gray, Muslims and Islam. And then you go, Maghrebis. Then in orange, you have Islam. And at the lowest level, you have the Gypsies, the Tzigan, who are the most hated in France as all over Europe. So the second point I want to make, you cannot study anti-Semitism in a vacuum. You must see that it is correlated to the other forms of prejudice, even though it has its specificity and quite a history. And that's anti-immigrant, to define oneself as racist, to be against communautarism, that's very important in France, anti-Semitic scale, anti-Islam scale, to beliefs that some races are superior to other. With all these questions, actually, you can make one big scale of racism, anti-Semitism. And the anti-Jews scale is correlated in proportion of 0.41. What's the least correlated is the biological racism, the old-fashioned racism, only 0.26. Now, I'd like to go back to a question which is important because it's like the old anti-Semitic belief that Jews have too much power in France. And first, look at the dotted line. It's the proportion of people who don't answer. You see that since the 80s, the proportion of people who don't answer has gotten lower. There's a polarization of opinions. 2, you see in blue, the people who reject the old stereotypes. And in red, you see the people who accept these stereotypes. That's, in France today, still the heart of anti-Semitism, linked to conspirational theories about the power of Jews, the idea that in French we say deux poids, deux mesures, that it's not that Jews are privileged compared to other minorities. And you see the 2 nice little peaks of the red line. It goes up to 34% in the year 2000 and after, the proportion of people who believe Jews have too much power. That's when is voted the reparation for the spoliations of Jews during World War II. And on the far right, there's the cry, well, why Jews? Why not reparations for other minorities? And then it goes down and it goes up again in 2014. It goes up at the time where pro-Palestinian demonstrations are forbidden. It's just after an intervention of the Israeli army in the occupied territories. And it's also the time where a humorist, Dieudonné, sees his show, anti-Semitic, censored. There again, there's the idea that Jews have the power. Look, they can influence and have these things censored. And then it goes down again. So the old stereotype is still there, but it goes up and down according to the context. Now, let's see the famous idea that Israel and the conflict are structuring anti-Semitism. Well, it's more complicated because it just doesn't interest public opinion. There's a question about the image of Israel. That's in 2022. Positive, 29%, negative, 25%. The majority are people who say neither positive nor negative, or I don't know. And it's the same about Palestine. And it's even worse when you ask people who is the most responsible of the continuation of the conflict between Israeli and Palestinian. You see Israel, 20%, Palestinians, 3%, both 59%. I don't know, 18%. So the 3/4 of the sample just are not interested by what's going on there. So it's not that structures anti-Semitism. And if you want to fight anti-Semitism, you must know what's the most pregnant, and it's not the Israeli conflict. Now, is it migrating anti-Semitism to the far left? No, it's more complicated. That's the proportion of people saying they have a negative image of Israel according to their position on the left-right scale. And you see, let's look at the 2022 curve in purple. You see that the curve goes up at both extremes, on the extreme left and on the extreme right. The proportion of people who say, I don't have a positive image of Israel is higher. So it's more complicated. Now, of course, when you are asked about who is responsible for the continuation of the conflict, on the left, they are far more prone to say it's the Palestinians than on the right. But, and that's what we're going to see, when we make a more statistical analysis of all these questions, including the questions about Israel, you see that actually you have different dimensions. There's one first factor, which is the old anti-Semitism. All items contribute, but those contribute the most to that dimension is Jews have too much power, Jews have a specific relation to money, Jews have a dual loyalty to Israel before France, Jews are a group apart, Jews are not as French as the other French. And the old items about a negative image of the religion, as well as all the questions about Israel and the conflict, they are very little correlated to that dimension. But there is a specific second dimension, which is all the attitudes about Israel and the conflict. And people who have a negative image of Israel and think Israel is responsible for the continuation of the conflict, they do not buy at all the usual anti-Semitic stereotypes. So it's two different worlds, two different visions, and the most important one is the old anti-Semitism. If you look at people who score high on that old anti-Semit axis, it's people who are elderly, more on the right and the far right, with little education and income, and intolerant to all minorities. They are the racist and anti-Semitic. But the high scorers on the new anti-Semitism, structured by the vision of Israel and the conflict, they are younger, they are left or far left, they have middle or high level of education and income, and they are tolerant. So, as I said in the beginning, it's more complicated. Old and new forms of anti-Semitism coexist, but the new one hasn't chased the old one. Actually, the most predominant in public opinion are the old anti-Semitic cliché about money, power, on loyalty, and they still prevail on the far right. There is anti-Semitism on the left. There is anti-Semitism among the green, but it's at lower levels than on the far right. The left and the far left are more critical of Israel, but they don't buy all these old clichés. Now, there's quite a debate about Muslim anti-Semitism. And they are indeed, when we have large enough numbers or specific studies, they are more anti-Semite than average, especially men and people who regularly practice the Muslim religion. But even if all Muslims were anti-Semitic, they don't form the bulk of the anti-Semitic in opinions in France. And even among Muslims who are anti-Semitic, they are more sensitive to the old cliché about money and power. And it's a paradox. If it's what's going on in Israel and in the occupied territories that triggers violent actions against Jews, it's very clear. It is not at all the case about opinions. And instead of going up, anti-Semitic opinions have been steadily, with ups and downs, but still steadily going down. So what I would like to say there is that opinions follow a different logic than actions. So it's only one aspect I have studied here, the opinions. It's important to compare. One should study also ideologies, one should study networks, what's the hate speeches on internet. One should study the demonstrations where one has heard these last years anti-Semitic slogans. But as far as opinions are concerned, it's not the new anti-Semitism that is dominant, and it's been going down steadily. And for me, it's important because it means that the norm is anti-Semitism. Two, of course, surveys have their limitations. And there's quite a debate in France. I don't know if you have it in the UK. What kind of survey do you use to measure racism or anti-Semitism? A lot of polling institutes use online surveys. It goes faster. The people can speak freely. They haven't in front of them an interviewer. There's not the effect of social desirability. And it costs much less. But there are problems. At the National Commission for Human Rights, we've had the possibility since 2016 to do at the same time and with the same questions, a questionnaire online and a questionnaire face-to-face at the home of the respondents. And sometimes there are differences of 20 to 25 points. People who answer online are more intolerant and a little more anti-Semitic. They're especially far more anti-Muslims. But the problem is the digital fracture and the fact that the surveys online have samples who are far less close to what France really is. In our sample on face-to-face, it's more working class and it has more people immigrant born. They are more mini model of what the French population is today. The online population is very different of actual France. So be careful of online survey results. Three, one really needs to contextualize studies because one thing is to give your opinion in a survey. But the important thing to understand anti-Semitism, like all forms of racism, is to look at everyday interactions in face-to-face. And that's why with Vincent Tibéry, we've done a couple of surveys on the phone in Sarcelles, in the suburbs of Paris, where you have a large Jewish population to the point that one of the neighborhoods is called the Small Jerusalem, the Petit Jerusalem. And we've done the same survey in Paris in the 19th, where there's also a section where the Lubavitch are very present. And it's also called the Petit Jerusalem. And these two surveys are interesting because they are in neighborhoods where you have at the same time a lot of Jews and a lot of Muslims. And what do we have asked in these two surveys very precise questions about do you meet people, who do you meet, with whom do you go out, where do you do your shopping, would you accept to have dinner with a family who is not of your religion, where do you want your children to go to school, where do you want to be buried? And on all the questions, we see that in everyday life, actually, interactions between Jews and Muslims are very simple. There's not fierce anti-Semitism in these two contexts, in spite of the presence in face-to-face of Jews and Muslims. And maybe just to give you an idea, we do a lot of survey experiments. And one of the experiments, that means you randomly split your sample, and you ask questions where you vary one of the conditions of the little story. So there it's the story of a pupil who has been spreading cartoons in the classroom in a high school. And 1/3 of the sample, it's anti-Semitic cartoons. The second third, it's Christian, anti-Christian cartoons. And the third one, it's anti-Muslim cartoons. And nobody knows that the same question is asked under different forms to other parts of the sample. And what does it show? It shows that in Sarcelles, where there have been anti-Jews riots, where there is a very large Jewish population, well, even in Sarcelles, and it's the same in the 19th, it's they ask what sanction should be taken against the pupil, and he has been expelled. Well, it's the anti-Semitic cartoons that are seen as those that one should punish the most severely. So there is still a taboo of anti-Semitism. But I'll finish on that just to show you that in these mixed environments, the old stereotypes are still there, more than the new anti-Semitism. Another experiment was about the police experiment. It's a man of 40 is aggressed by a group of young, and one part of the sample, they scream, "Dirty Jew," the other, they scream, "Dirty French," the other, "Dirty Black," and the other, "Dirty Arab." So it's Jews come a little ahead in the seriousness, but not very big differences. But then one asks, and what will the police do? Do you think they'll do nothing? Or shall they do their best in order to find and punish the culprits? And there one sees that the old anti-Semitic stereotype peeps up, a majority in all the sample, and even more among Muslims, but in all the sample, believes that if it's the Jews that have been assaulted, the police will do something. It's the only group for which there's a majority of the sample thinking that the police will do something. And that means that to understand ordinary anti-Semitism, we must go back to everyday life and the interactions between Jews, Muslims, and other minorities in Sarcelles, because you have 120 nationalities. And there you see that Jews are indeed seen as closer of the French descending of French population than of the visible minorities, because they have been there longer, because they have, even if they have immigrant born, they have a little higher level of income and education. They are seen on the side of power and influence. So if you really want to fight anti-Semitism, it's these old stereotypes you should fight before talking about the spread of new anti-Semitism. And I'll stop there in order to have time for the discussion.
Nonna, thank you very much indeed. That was a really rich and fascinating talk, both on the, if you like, on the quantitative, on the statistical side, and with qualitative reflections based on your research as well. One of the questions, well, before I start, I'll just say to everyone, when you have a question, please do raise your virtual hand, and I'll call on you. I see already that a couple have their virtual hands up. But I'll just start by asking Nonna whether, to what extent, the division between old and new anti-Semitisms is reflected in the attitudes that the surveys find. In other words, whether looking for this division between old and new in the surveys is the right path. Certainly, some of the evidence that we have from the UK is to suggest that where you have anti-Zionism or criticism of Israel that slips into anti-Semitism, it doesn't depart from the old stereotypes, but rather it repurposes and reuses the old stereotypes. So the ideas about money and power find a new articulated in a new context. So that perhaps it's a mistake to expect a completely new set of stereotypes.
Okay, but I think it's a very interesting question, and it's a debate I have had with Pierre-André Taguieff about that debate. But you see, the problem is, of course, they are connected, but there are two things. They are connected in the way you told you, and the hate of Israel or the demonization of Israel revitalizes old stereotypes about money and power. It's the idea of the Zionist plot. And so all that is very connected. What I'm trying to look at with my survey data is that in public opinion at large, they know not much about Zionism. It's not a word that you hear frequently. We did once an experiment with an open question about what do you put behind Zionism, and the majority of the sample had not the slightest idea. I mean, it's not anti-Zionism that feeds the public opinion at large anti-Semitism. That's what I wanted to say. That's the first thing. Two, even more, when the war of 1967 started, public opinion was very much in favor of Israel. They had a fantastic image. It was the little country attacked by the Arabs there. And then when the occupation settled, the image of Israel, it's very interesting to look at the surveys since 1967. The image of Israel crumbled, became negative, and gradually the proportion of people who are tired of hearing about that unending conflict has been going up. So that's the second point to say. It's important. Yes, you see in demonstrations, you'll have anti-Zionist posters, but when you talk with people and when you ask them questions, they are really tired of the conflict. It's not that they reproach to the Jews first. In some circles, yes, some people who will be interested in what's going on in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, people who are of immigrant origin, people who will feel solidarity with the Palestinians. Yes, but it's a very small portion of France. They are young people of immigrant descent, Muslim or not, for whom, in a way, what's going on in Palestine and in the occupied territories, it's their Vietnam War. It's a cause that they are happy to defend. It gives a meaning to their life, but they're extremely small group. What I try to show is what's going on in public opinion at large. And in public opinion at large, they don't give a damn about what's going on there. They're tired of it. There's a big whiff of emotion every time there is Tsahal's intervention in the occupied territories, and it falls back as quickly. But there's a lot of ignorance. And what comes up when you try to talk is that history of money and power. And it's ambivalent because it's in some, I remember we did also non-directive interviews, and the idea was Oh, they have more money, but it's normal. They work. If the Arabs worked like them, if the black works as much as they do. But it's ambivalent because a positive stereotype can turn again in resentments against these people who have more money, more power, they are more listened to, they are better organized. That's the only thing I want to say. But of course, you're right, there are connections. And also, anti-Semitism has such a long history. All the stereotypes have been piling up over centuries. It's fantastic. You can just pick in the one you want. They're all connected. They add to each other. There's the Christian anti-Semitism. There's the racial anti-Semitism, the Nazi ones. There's the left-wing anti-Semitism. The Jews are the Rothschilds. They are the capitalists. They have the money. You have the anti-Israel. The creation of Israel created a new layer of anti-Semitism with the idea of the dual loyalty. So all that adds up and piles up, and the policies of Israel since 1967 have accentuated the bad, negative image of Israel. But the only thing I want to show is that what's really deeply there and more important than what's going on in Israel is that idea that they have money and they have power. And that came up with the COVID. So of course it connects, because then you say, there's a plot, a Zionist plot and all that. But it's these old stereotypes. So I think we must be really careful with, because you can kill in the name of these stereotypes.
Thank you, Nonna. Thank you very much. We have a question from Tony Cummins. Would you like to?
Yes. Sorry, I don't have my video completely available. I'm an American Jew. I live in Paris. I'm a journalist. And one of the things that I hear a lot about when talking about anti-Jewish sentiment in France is that there's a tendency to erase the Jewish experience and the specifically Jewish experience from the Shoah. Would you address that?
From whom? Who wants to erase? Do you mean to say that there's a revisionist trend, that there's a negationist trend?
In society, among government officials, there's a tendency to negate the specific Jewish experience of the Shoah.
I would say exactly the opposite. The reason why there was in the 90s, at the end of the 90s, there was the creation of the memorial for the Shoah, and it's at the heart of the policies of the government. They have a lot of money because there's been all that debate about reparations for the spoliations of Jews during World War II. There's money there, and I would say on the opposite, it is at the heart of the policy, never forget. You have a couple of memorials in France, Le Camp des Mille, there's that everywhere, there's the idea, we must never forget. So I wouldn't say that. What gives you the idea that they are trying to negate?
Well, for example, there's an exhibit currently at the Musée de Libération in the 14th arrondissement of war photographers,
Yes.
women war photographers. And there are photographs of the camps and of dead bodies piled up in the camps, and no mention of Jews at all. And then later in the exhibit, you have photographs of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the only people that are mentioned as victims are the Arabs and the Palestinians, and no mention of Jews at all, or Israelis, nothing. That's one example.
I will go there and look at that exhibition, which I haven't seen, but you cannot generalize from among. It'll be interesting to look at who did the exhibition, how it was organized, but you cannot generalize to the government, because I would say on the opposite. I think also of another important achievement, which is the creation in 2012, after the Mera attacks, of the Dilkra, which is an interministerial delegation to fight against all forms of racism, anti-Semitism, and more recently LGBTs. But at the heart of the plan, the annual plan of the DILCRA, there is the fight against anti-Semitism. And a lot of money goes into research to understand. So there's certainly maybe exhibits like the one you described, and people who consider one speaks too much that's one of the questions we ask. Today, one speaks too much of the Holocaust and of the Shoah, but it's a proportion like 16, 17% of the population who thinks that. And as far as the government is concerned, I really wouldn't accuse them of that. But certainly, you make me curious, and I think I'll go to see that exhibition with the photographs, because in no way can one banalize, normalize what happened during World War II. But for me, it still remains as a taboo, and the state has been doing everything it can to preserve the memory of the Shoah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jan Rybak, you have a question or a comment.
Yeah, thank you. So my question is like supposedly about the data, but it's actually not. So I take a bit of an issue with this concept of Muslim anti-Semitism as one category alongside left and right anti-Semitism. So I'm obviously not arguing that Muslims cannot be anti-Semitic. It's a different issue. So don't people either practicing Islam or with a Muslim family background also have political identities and allegiances, which we may classify in a right-left category? And don't we take agency away from them if we classify them only as Muslims? Because on the reverse, like then non-Muslims have chosen political identities and Muslims don't. So can you speak to these like categorizations and the problems, the limitations, and why using these categorizations?
Well, of
and
course,
what does it add, and what does it hide in the study then?
So I am working on anti-Semitism, and I do not start with the idea there is a specific Muslim. I try to see Muslim anti-Semitism. I try to see what is the state of prejudice in France, looking at all forms of prejudice with the idea that you may be a victim of prejudice, and be prejudiced yourself. I mean, it's another debate to look at structural racism and anti-Semitism or systemic, but here I'm only working on prejudice, on opinions. And what you are saying, of course, being a Muslim, I'm not at all essentializing neither the Muslims nor the Jews. I mean, you are always more than like being a woman. I'm not only a woman. There's a question of generation, of political identity, of origin. So when we try to see what are the factors that account for high scores on, for instance, our scales of anti-Semitism, it's never one question, it's 10 or so questions to allow me to make a score of anti-Semitism. I'm not essentializing Muslims. On the contrary, I'm trying to see if being a Muslim adds something, taking into consideration social class, origin, country of origin, religious practice, and it in no way do we try to put a label on people. No, we are trying to see, we do intersectional approaches. We are trying to see how all these different dimensions of one's identity mix and how they can help reinforce or play against prejudice, be it anti-Semitism or the others. So I really don't, I'm not at all on the line of definition a priori. What I do define is anti-Semitism, and I have an operational definition, which is the prejudice against Jews or people who are seen as Jews. And I try to do the same with all the prejudices. It's the idea that you have an aversion to someone that you specifically there essentialize. That's racism. You don't see a person, you see a group, and you attribute to the person the characteristics of a group. And I try to see how it functions for anti-Semitism, for Islamophobia, because I do the exact same work on Islamophobia, and for all types of prejudice, because there are connections between these forms of prejudice and prejudice against women and prejudice against gays and prejudice against people who have a handicap. It's what all the discussions about what one calls in Germany group-focused enmity. I try to see how people think and how they connect. And some people are more prone than the others to have prejudice against everybody.
If one more sentence, but this is not this is not the way you're presenting it, no? I mean, in the abstract, you're speaking of the rise of new forms of prejudice emanating from the far left and from among Muslims.
No,
So,
I'm not saying that.
This is what it says in the abstract.
I never say that.
And this is what
I never say that.
Use, no?
I never say that. I look at where the person who has the highest level of prejudice places herself on the left-right scale, of which parties the person says she is closer, and how the person voted in the last election. And that allows me to see that it is on the far right, on people who have voted for Le Pen, that the level of anti-Semitism is at its highest. That's totally not what you are saying. I'm not speaking of the parties, I'm speaking of the political orientations of a person there, actually. For myself, I never say the left or the right, because there are so many ways to be the left or to be the right. I'm just looking at the political orientations of individuals here. I'm not at all in the study of the parties, which is another line of research and which is essential. And where things are far more complicated, because contrary to what many people say on the right, there has been recently, I was talking with David at the Senate, there was a symposium organized by the CRIF, the Representative Council of Jewish Institutions in France, and with the Green, in order to study together anti-Semitism and possible anti-Semitism on the left. And there is anti-Semitism on people who are left-wing, but it is more frequent on people who define themselves and vote on the right and on the far right. But that doesn't mean that there isn't anti-Semitism among people on the left, on the far left. But it's at the level of the individuals that you work with a survey, not at the level of the parties and of their ideological positions. Is that clearer?
No, but it's fine. Let's move to there. I'm sure there are many other questions. But
thank you,
Jan.
Very
much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Mike Burkhoff.
Hello. Thank you for a very interesting talk. In early April, I visited just for a few days southern Spain, and we spent a day in Cordoba, went to the Sephardi Museum there. Also, we found that there was a huge interest from the Spanish populations in their own history, which has obviously disappeared to some extent, or at least accounts of it had disappeared in Spain for a long time during the fascist era, etc. And I found similarly, a couple of years back when I visited Prague, a huge interest from local populations, again, in the Jewish populations that had lived in Prague in the Czech Republic, in Czechoslovakia as it was. So I was wondering, in France, is there this sort of interest growing in their own history? Because it's a major part of French history, as it is in Britain, but even more so perhaps in France. And that seems to be a great way of opposing anti-Semitism, in that you actually look at the history of your own country and you see huge amounts that are part of their own existence. I was wondering if that happens in France particularly.
Well, what I was talking of before, the Foundation for the Memory of the Shoah, is funding researchers, and there is an interest for the histories of what we did, what happened in France during the occupation. There was for a long time a taboo what really happened during World War II, but now you have an explosion of works in the last 30 years about facing the past, the responsibility of the state, the responsibility of the police. There's the sentence of Jacques Chirac, recognizing what the French state had done. So I would say we have that will to look back at the past of World War II. That's really something that's important for France. But even before, we have a lot of books, and we also have books coming out on what is the common history of Jews and Muslims, especially
Yes.
Jews and Muslims coming from North Africa,
Yes.
with the history of the decolonization on one hand, what they have in common and what makes them different. And there were two very interesting exhibitions about that history of Jews and Muslim across the Mediterranean. There was one at the Cité de l'Immigration. There were several things. So there is really an interest about the past, not only the World War II past and the responsibility of the state of Vichy, but what happened before, with the idea that we have often a caricature of the relations between Jews and Muslims, and that must go back deeper to the everyday relations in Tunisia, Morocco, Egypt. There is a trend there of memories, as there is for all minorities, I would say also. Everybody is re-exploring the past with sometimes the risk of a competition between memories, but that's another debate.
I wasn't only thinking of the bad parts of the past, obviously the
Yeah.
Shoah, and if we look at Spain, the expulsions and so on. I was thinking of the general contributions made, not just by Jews, but in this case by Jews, to the general civilization of that particular country. It's a major part of French history, as it is in many other countries. I remember in Prague, it was incredible the amount of Jewish history there was there, and hardly a Jewish population. And I was wondering if that is anyway growing in France, as not just the negative bits. I'm talking about, you know.
No, you're right. Of course, the positive bit, maybe less, but maybe also because we have the largest Jewish population in Europe. So it's not the same thing to have practically no Jews left and then the necessity to go back to the past and put it forward, as when you have a lively Jewish communities, because it doesn't exist, a Jewish community. But I'm going to look into it. I saw it more as the idea of encounters between Jews and Muslims, not only to the specific contribution of Jews to history. There's somebody like Pierre Birnbaum would be the best to answer you, because he has traced the contribution of French Jews since the revolution. So there are books. I don't know if there are many, but there are some.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. We have a few minutes left, so if someone does have a question, please raise your virtual hand. But I'll take advantage of this moment, just perhaps to go back to my earlier question to Nonna, Nonna's answer, and to the discussion with Jan.
Yes, I'd like to go back to Jan, yeah.
And I wonder how much, I mean, this is a field which is full of controversy. And I'm not suggesting that what I'm about to say it is the whole of why there is controversy, but one of the points of controversy is that different people are looking at different objects, at different subjects. So you were very clear that you were looking at anti-Semitism across the population as a whole. Whereas for some other people, their object of study is the question of anti-Semitism within those elements of the politically active population who are critical of Israel, for example. So my question is, to what extent do you think we could make progress by making greater care over what the object of discussion really is?
That's the premier. You must start by that. I mean, if not, we are not talking of the same thing. But you see, it seemed important to me. There are people working on ideologies, on parties, on left-wing anti-Semitism. There's the work of Robert Hirsch, for instance, has written a book on anti-Semitism of the left at the level of the party. He is a Trotskyist, and he tried to see how there was anti-Semitism in his own party. There are a lot of very interesting books about parties, and there's anti-Semitism and how we have a story of anti-Semitism in France, and there are interesting works. But I think we should all work in parallel and confront our findings, but it doesn't help me. I'm trying to do something different, for which me and my team, we have been severely attacked, because the moment you start working on prejudice, we are considered, because we worked on all forms of prejudice, and especially on prejudice against Muslims, we were attacked as being dangerous Islamo-leftists. So I think it's very important to continue that study on prejudice, and it's only one part of the reality. So we need to confront it with people who work on political parties, people who work on speeches, people who work on networks and social networks, because there's something really going on there. People who work on posters and demonstrations. You need to confront our findings. So I'm very open to that discussion. It's not that everybody has been working on these different, in these different fields of research, and discussing with them is very useful. But for me, for the present moment, I'm more in public opinion and now in interpersonal relations or intercultural relations with ethnography, fieldwork. And that's really interesting, and it completes our vision, because we were attacked when we come out every year with the survey of the National Commission for Human Rights. People say, you have nothing against anti-French racism. So we try to explain that racism against the majority is not at all on the same level than racism of the majority against its minorities. And then they also reproached us of not taking into account racism between minorities. So there's a lot of research there, and there is racism. I mean, you can be a victim and you can have prejudice and stereotypes against the other. So that's my field of research for the moment. But of course, you cannot understand opinions without understanding the political context. So that means that I also have to look at which are the parties that in France today, as far as anti-Semitism is concerned, for instance, have put forward anti-Semitic discourses. And it's not on the left that I find that.
Absolutely. Ephraim Nissan, you have a question.
Yes, I just wanted to say two things. One, two proverbs that I had in the 90s and that perhaps reflect the perception of Jews 50 years earlier. One was that France is a country where an anti-Semite is one that hates the Jews too much. And the other one is that Britain is the country where it is worse to say that somebody is anti-Semitic than being one, actually. And the other thing is that three anecdotes when I was in France, just briefly. In 1929, it was iconic. I was at a conference in Paris, and sitting near me, there was a reporter, and he was trying to be friendly. When I gave my lecture and I understood from what I was saying that I was Jewish, he was so visibly disgusted, and then just when he stood up to go away, you should see his face, just I was no longer a human for him. But then, when I was on the bus and I gave my seat to a young black lady who was holding a toddler who was white in her arms, you should see which reproachful stares I was given by the people around for giving her my place. And there was in Lecteur pour tout just an opinion written about something like that on the tram in Paris of somebody who gives an explanation to a visitor from Japan. And for that reason, he's stared so hatefully by the others that he has to alight from the metro, from the underground at an earlier stop, at the first stop. And in 1985, I had to give a lecture in Avignon. And as it was an occasion also touristic, I went with my mother and we were talking Italian near the walls of the city. A man, aged perhaps 40, heard us and wanted to boast up. He didn't know that we were Jewish. He said, "Moi, les Juifs, je les rosse." That is, I, the Jews, I beat them up. And he started to run after a young man and young woman who started to run and flee in the direction of the road that leads to the new synagogue in Avignon. And people who were watching him running after them were saying, "Il est demi-juif," he is half Jewish.
I'm very sorry that you had so terrible experiences
Yes,
with French people.
The anecdotes that remain as iconic. It is anecdotal, but I think that you remember them when they happen.
Oh, of course. I mean, there's nothing that hurts more, and I'm very sorry that you experienced these things. But at the same time, I can give you a lot of positive examples, especially in the research we are doing today with Ben Kingsley and Ben Gidley, sorry, and on encounters between Jews and Muslims.
Yes,
and there it's really interesting because you see that there are associations of dance, of music, of learning together Hebrew and Arabic, where there is an open, friendly society. And so it depends who you meet. And I think I'm very sorry that you saw the bad part of
actually
the French
what you're
society.
saying, I can corroborate it, because at the conference that I gave in Paris in 1985, I had to give my lecture with somebody from Egypt in Paris, whose name was Fatih Dabili, and with somebody, he was giving it about computational linguistics for Arabic, for Hebrew, and another one about Vietnamese. And you know that in French, c'est de l'hébreu pour moi, or
Yes.
c'est de l'arabe pour moi, it is Arabic or Hebrew for me, and then Vietnamese. Before we gave our lectures, all people were starting to go away. But it was very friendly indeed. And I found it very comforting to see young women, one black and one white, who were looking at each other more friendly than that. It cannot be. And so that also in London.
I think we are out of time now, Ephraim. I think you will have to come to an end. I'm sorry.
Yes, indeed, I have finished. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, as I say, we are out of time. Before I thank Nonna, I'd just like to mention we have our next seminar on the 28th of June, when we will have Mark Volovici, who used to be at BISA and is now at the University of Haifa, talking to the title Between Self-Determination and Self-Censorship, Anti-Semitism and Interwar Jewish Politics. But before ending, I would like to thank Nonna for a talk which is both empirically rich and analytically sophisticated, bringing together quantitative and qualitative material and really giving us a very multifaceted sense of if you like, of both the presence and the location of anti-Semitism in France today, and of the debates that surround that subject. So thank you very much indeed, Nonna. It's been wonderful hearing from you, and thank you to you all who have asked questions and who have come along. And I look forward to seeing you all again at another event in the future. Thank you all very much.
And thank you for inviting me and for these exchanges. Thank you.
Thank you very much.